There are places in history where the surface never cracked, but the foundations trembled, where centuries pass like shadows, and in the breath between one truth and the next, something older continues to whisper. What if knowledge had a spine that bent in the dark? What if the pursuit of light required one to pass through gold that breathes through silence, that burns through symbols that were never meant to be spoken? Beneath the structure of science, beneath the mortar of theology, beneath even the bones of empire, there were gardens grown in secret hands that drew the rose on stone eyes that waited patient behind the veil. Not to be seen, but to remain, to survive, to pass on. This is deformed history, and tonight we descend into the quiet fracture of alchemy and the Rosicrucians. A wheel turns not in the open, but under the surface, a slow axis buried in the soft sediment of time. It does not announce itself. It does not protest. It tilts a fraction just enough that the stars realign not above, but within the mind of the observer. Just enough for a map to lose its compass. Just enough for meaning to slip out of place like a breath held too long. A scholar in the 17th century mistakes a shadow for a principle. A scribe rewrites a margin, and the world folds slightly. A manuscript is copied by trembling hands, its ink faded before the ink dries. These are not events, not turning points. They are the drift of a thought from one register to another. They are a resonance no longer audible, but still shaping the architecture of silence. The fracture does not begin with destruction, but with attention. In the early hours of modern Europe, amidst the clatter of printing presses and the rustle of heretical pamphlets, a peculiar murmur began to stir. It was not named at first, only felt a discomfort in the ordering of things, a sliver in the foundation of knowledge. The world once gridded by the church and measured by the stars began to loosen its frame. Certainties thinned. Authority became porous. And from the edges where medicine blurred into mysticism, where astronomy kissed the language of spirits, where metals were not yet matter, but metaphor, there rose a whisper of something old, something forbidden, and something not yet gone. It was not a movement, not a doctrine, not a rebellion. It was a subtle dissonance, a misalignment in the grammar of knowing. The name would come later, Rosicrucian. A rose, a cross. The union of the ephemeral and the eternal. A symbol not of faith but of inquiry wrapped in secrecy. It would not be preached, only hinted. It would not be found, only sought, and always it would hover just beyond what was allowed to be understood. But the whisper did not begin with them. It curled out from ancient mouths, written in forgotten alphabets. From Alexandria, where scrolls burned not once, but again and again, as though the act of erasure had to be rehearsed. From Babylon, where stars were not mapped but invoked. From Egypt, where stone spoke to the heavens in geometries we still do not comprehend. Knowledge older than science, older than scripture, not falsified, only hidden. Hidden because it could not be simplified. And yet by the early 1600s something moved. In 1614, an anonymous manifesto appeared in Kassel, Germany. Fama Fraternitatis, it called itself the Fame of the Brotherhood. It spoke of a secret society of enlightened men, followers of a mysterious figure named Christian Rosenkreuz, who had journeyed to the East and returned bearing sacred wisdom. The manifesto claimed no power, offered no initiation, demanded no loyalty. It simply revealed. A myth, perhaps, a construction. But it rippled across Europe like a disturbance in still water. Then in 1615, another text followed Confessio Fraternitatis, a confession, but not of guilt of purpose, of a quiet intention to reform all arts and sciences, to heal the human understanding not with doctrine, but with alignment, with an inner science, a return to the pure knowing that predated the schisms of dogma and doubt. Some believed, some mocked, some searched for the brotherhood in vain. But what mattered was not who believed, it was that the shape of belief itself had shifted. Because in the heart of this whisper was not a claim, but a question. What if knowledge had been broken deliberately? What if the pieces still spoke? Alchemy, long before it became the caricature of charlatans seeking gold, was this very question in motion. It was the study of correspondences, not substances. A meditation on transformation, not manufacture. The furnace was not a laboratory, but a crucible of the soul. To transmute lead into gold was to trace the path from confusion to clarity, from base to noble, from man to more than man. And so in that slight tilt of history, the Rosicrucians appeared not to declare a new truth, but to unearth a buried one. And the fracture widened. In the universities of England, men who studied optics and gravity kept secret notebooks filled with symbols. Isaac Newton, hero of the rational devoted years, not to calculus, but to decoding alchemical texts. He believed in transmutation. He believed in the philosopher's stone. He believed that nature spoke in riddles, not formulas. His manuscripts, once hidden in the vaults of Cambridge, now confirm what polite history tried to forget, that the architect of modern physics believed the deepest laws were written in allegory. But he was not alone. The fracture was not in the men, but in the moment. A moment when science had not yet purged the sacred, when knowledge was still woven with mystery, when the boundary between knowing and becoming had not been sealed. And at that threshold, neither past nor future, neither heresy nor proof, the Rosicrucian current flowed quietly beneath the noise of revolutions and reformations. Not as an organization, but as a resonance, a schema without center, a rose drawn in water. And always the question returns: was this a conspiracy? A fiction? A poetic invention? Or was it something else, an echo of an intelligence not meant to dominate, but to endure? There is no answer, only a subtle leaning of thought. A dissonance that never resolves, but lingers like a breath not fully exhaled. If truth were a flame, then perhaps knowledge is the smoke curling, obscuring, drifting through unseen corridors. Not the fire that consumes, but the residue it leaves behind. And if the Rosicrucian manifestos were smoke, then somewhere something had burned. In the year 1616, the third of the manifestos emerged, the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. Unlike the prior texts, it did not describe a doctrine or make claims of reformation. It was a vision, or something like a dream, a story saturated in symbols, sealed in allegory, layered like stone upon stone in a forgotten tomb. It described a journey, a castle, a wedding. But it was not a tale of celebration. It was a ritual. It was a map without coordinates. It was a key left in the open invisible unless you had the shape of the lock. And in this wedding of opposites, of king and queen, of death and transmutation, the whisper of alchemy returned. For those attuned to the ancient patterns, the metaphors were clear: the 7 days of initiation, the planetary gates, the trials, the crucifixion, the rebirth, not of a man, but of the mind, not of the body, but of understanding. The Rosicrucian mythos was never linear. It resisted the language of fact. It moved through symbol the way a shadow moves through dusk fluid ungraspable, yet undeniably there. And in this resistance lay its power. To the institutions of Europe, whether crown or crosier, the Rosicrucians offered a problem that could not be solved by sword or sermon. They claimed no temple, no leaders, no treasure, only an idea that hidden knowledge had survived, and that those who sought it in silence and in solitude could find the path inward and downward. For alchemy, too, was never simply the pursuit of transmuting metals. It was the art of descent, of entering the base, the impure, the corrupted, and not fleeing from it, but transforming it. Lead was never just lead. It was density. It was slowness. It was the part of the soul that could not rise until it was purified. The furnace was not a place of destruction, but of becoming. The black stage negredo was the beginning, not the end. Putrefaction, decomposition, darkness. These were not failures, but necessary initiations. Only what had been broken could be reformed. And within this metaphor, the Rosicrucian texts nested themselves like seeds in fertile decay. Germany, England, France, the manifestos spread through the hands of printers and wanderers, scholars and skeptics, mystics and mathematicians. Some saw them as satire, some as prophecy, others as provocation, proof that a secret society truly did walk in silence among them. The Catholic Church found itself caught off guard. Protestant thinkers debated whether the brotherhood were agents of God or Lucifer. Kings and courtiers demanded names, but none came forward, because there were no names, or too many. And still beneath the surface of power, something shifted. Libraries began to swell with esoteric volumes. Books once hidden in monasteries found their way into private collections. The printing press, once a tool of reformers, became a vessel for symbols: the emerald tablet, the corpus hermeticum, the Zohar. Kabbalistic diagrams, astrological treatises, arcane geometries, they slipped between the lines of reason and reformation, like oil into water. And in this growing tide, the lines between sacred and scientific blurred. It is no coincidence that the founders of modern science, those who built the very skeleton of our measurable world, were also drawn to this current. Robert Fludd, a physician and philosopher, rejected the narrow optics of empirical thinking. He mapped the universe not with numbers, but with music proportion and divine correspondence. To him, the microcosm of man mirrored the macrocosm of creation. The pulse of a vein echoed the pulse of the stars. Francis Bacon, the architect of the scientific method, was not blind to these whispers. His New Atlantis spoke of a hidden society dedicated to the preservation of sacred knowledge, living apart from the world watching it unfold. They were not called Rosicrucians, but the resemblance was uncanny. And still no one proved the brotherhood existed, but neither could they be dismissed. Because what the Rosicrucians offered was not evidence, but permission. Permission to imagine that the boundaries of knowledge were illusions. Permission to descend rather than ascend. To seek transformation not in conquest, but in mystery. And so the fracture deepened. The university and the lodge, the laboratory and the altar, the telescope and the scrying bowl. Each existed not in opposition, but in silent orbit. A dual language of knowing emerged, the public tongue of demonstration and the private tongue of initiation. Those who mastered both walked unseen between worlds. And in the spaces between disciplines, between sacred and profane, the Rosicrucian impulse flowed like water through cracks in a stone. Was it fiction? A literary game? A clever mirror held to a fractured Europe? Perhaps, but the mirror reflects nonetheless, and what it reflects is not just the past, but the fracture itself. A world beginning to question its own scaffolding, a knowledge system discovering that its roots were deeper and darker than it dared to admit, and in the scent of ink and the hush of pages turned in candlelight, something old began to wake. It did not demand belief, it required only attention, and those who gave it heard the whisper grow louder. A letter arrives without a sender. A book appears without a name. A rumor walks through the salons of Europe, cloaked in ink and bearing no face. And yet it spreads not like a proclamation, but like a question written in wind: who are the Rosicrucians? By the time the third manifesto had settled into the libraries and curiosities of the curious, the shadow it cast had lengthened. It no longer mattered whether the brotherhood truly existed in cloister or code. What mattered was the idea that knowledge could be secret, sacred, and structured beyond the reach of empire or institution. The world as drawn by those in power had a shape: kingdoms and laws, pulpits and courts. But the world as felt by those who read the Fama and the Confessio, it had layers, some visible, some veiled, some too deep to be called by name. This was not a map to be followed, but a veil to be parted. In the quiet corners of universities, professors marked margins with strange symbols. Astrologers folded Rosicrucian principles into horoscopes. Physicians began to wonder if illness was more than imbalance, if it was alchemical spiritual, a sign of inward transmutation left unfinished. And slowly the manifestos began to draw seekers, but they did not draw them in the manner of a cult. There were no oaths, no cloaks, no visible temples. The draw was subtler, quieter, an inward tilt of perception, a recognition that somewhere behind the curtain of common thought, something else was being preserved. What did they believe the manifestos never quite say? They speak of reformation, not of churches, but of arts. They speak of a science that is not separate from faith, and a faith that does not deny experiment. They speak of a wisdom that is older than Scripture, yet somehow more intimate. And at the center of it all, Christian Rosenkreuz. He was not described as a prophet, nor a Messiah, nor even a man of miracles. He was a traveler, a man who had wandered through Arabia, Egypt, and Persia, absorbing the hidden traditions of each land. He returned not to conquer, but to conceal, not to speak, but to encode. Was he real? The texts do not insist. Perhaps he was a symbol of transmission, of synthesis, of that which passes from hand to hand unseen. A rose opening not in the light but in the dark. And around this rose Europe trembled. In a time when religious wars tore the continent into blood-soaked borders, the Rosicrucians refused to pick sides. They were neither wholly Christian nor wholly pagan, neither Protestant nor Catholic. Their language was older, more elemental. They spoke in the terms of fire and salt mercury and sulfur sun and moon body and spirit. They read nature like scripture and scripture like metaphor. They did not deny science, but they did not divide it from soul. To them the universe was not inert. It was alive, breathing, singing. And this belief, this quiet heresy echoed where no orthodoxy could follow. Across France, murmurs of a hidden fraternity stirred the minds of thinkers and magicians. In England, they were whispered about in the same breath as the Freemasons, though no clear link was ever drawn. In Italy, some saw in them the last flicker of the Hermetic tradition, smuggled through centuries of suppression. And still no evidence, no document signed in blood, no lists of members, no architecture to investigate. Just symbols, ideas, recurring patterns in art, in stone, in language. A rose, a cross, a wedding of opposites, a call to remember something the world had tried to forget. What had been lost? Perhaps it was the idea that knowledge was more than accumulation, that it was transformation, that to know something truly, one must become it, must dissolve into it, must be changed by it. This was not the kind of knowing taught in schools. This was the knowing of the alchemist. And alchemy, by the 17th century, was already slipping into ridicule. Kings had been tricked by false philosophers. Gold had not materialized from lead. Courts had tired of waiting. But real alchemists had never promised gold. They had promised the great work, the transmutation of the self. The Rosicrucians knew this. Their texts were saturated in alchemical language, not the recipes of metallurgy, but the metaphors of initiation. The journey through blackness into whitening, then reddening, the spiral path inward, the symbolic death, the silent rebirth. And just as the alchemist sealed his vessel and waited for the transformation to occur in darkness, so too did the Rosicrucian idea disappear from view, only to reappear later altered. In the decades that followed the manifestos, Europe would erupt into the 30 Years' War. Cities would burn, knowledge would become a weapon, universities would calcify, religion would polarize, borders would be drawn not just on maps, but on minds. And in this chaos, the Rosicrucians vanished. Or so it seemed. But they had never claimed visibility. They had never promised presence. Their gift was not permanence but recurrence. They returned in whispers, in esoteric salons of the Enlightenment, in the symbolism of secret societies, in the margins of Newton's notebooks, in the architecture of Masonic temples, in the diagrams of mystical anatomies. Always partial, always veiled, as though the very essence of their knowledge required concealment, because what they offered was not a doctrine, but a disruption, a fracture in the smooth narrative of progress, a reminder that some knowledge does not ascend in a straight line, but coils like smoke, like serpent, like memory. And so the question returns again and again, did the Rosicrucians exist? Perhaps the better question is, why did we need them to? Why at that precise moment in history did Europe imagine a secret brotherhood of enlightened minds working silently to restore lost wisdom? What does that longing reveal? What had been forgotten or buried or burned? And why does the symbol of the rose pierced by the cross still linger in the places where knowledge turns strange? Perhaps the whisper has not ended. Perhaps it never does. A garden once walled now lies in ruin. Vines reclaim its gate. The stone path has cracked, swallowed by moss and silence. Yet if you step softly, if your breath does not disturb the dust, you might still see the outline of something once tended carefully. A circle, a pattern, a design too deliberate to be accidental. Such was the world of Europe in the 17th century. Cracked, silent, yet layered with intention. The age of faith was bleeding into the age of reason. The altar gave way to the academy. But in the space between the two, where certainty had not yet calcified and questions still trembled like leaves in wind, alchemy persisted, and with it a certain tension began to emerge. To the world, alchemy was spectacle and failure. Puffed beards and bubbling flasks, men hunched over crucibles chasing gold that never came. It was dismissed as pre-scientific, as the infant dreaming of the chemist. But this was only the surface, a surface designed to be misunderstood, because beneath it something else endured, a practice older than metal, a worldview that did not separate matter from spirit, but saw them as entwined, breathing through one another, not in competition, but in reflection. The Rosicrucians knew this, or perhaps more accurately, they embodied this. They did not claim to invent alchemy, they claimed to protect its inner meaning, to veil its symbols from those who sought only gold, and offer its depths to those who sought something stranger. Not wealth, not power, but transfiguration. They saw in the art of transformation a mirror of the human journey. Lead was not just metal, it was the unawakened self, fixed, heavy, bound by the lowest of forces. Gold was not just treasure, it was the realized being, refined, luminous, resilient. The process of change was not an act of chemistry, but a ritual of becoming. First came the negredo, the blackening, the descent, confusion, despair, the breaking of the old identity. Then the albedo, the whitening, the washing, a clarity born not of light, but of having passed through darkness. And finally the rubedo, the reddening, the emergence of the philosopher's stone, the fusion of opposites, the radiant union of what had been split. These were not steps in a formula, they were initiations, stages through which both matter and spirit must pass. And in the Rosicrucian texts, these alchemical stages did not appear as instructions, but as architecture. The chemical wedding, for example, was more than an allegory. It was a 7-day journey through chambers of transformation, each day a layer stripped, a symbol revealed, a paradox offered and left unresolved. The wedding itself, a union of a king and a queen, was not romantic. It was cosmic. It represented the alchemical conjunctio, the union of sun and moon, sulfur and mercury, soul and body. The reconciliation of that which had been severed. And in this ritual, the seeker saw a reflection not of others but of themselves. It was a script written to awaken something. Not belief, but awareness. And as the Rosicrucian mythos spread, so did the yearning it carried. Because beneath the surface of Europe's progress, something was unsettled. The Reformation had fractured the Church, replacing ritual with scripture, but offering little solace to the mystical. The rise of empirical science brought precision and observation, but severed the world from enchantment. The Enlightenment championed reason, but it began to bleach the sacred from the sky. In this vacuum, the Rosicrucians stood not as resistance, but as remembrance. They reminded the world that knowledge once had mystery, that seeking once meant silence, that to understand something fully you might have to lose yourself within it. And so their symbols found new homes, engraved on the floors of secret lodges, etched into the spines of esoteric books, hidden in paintings, in architecture, in encoded texts whispered across generations. Their influence rippled outward. In Germany, their philosophies blended with the Pietist movement, infusing Christianity with mysticism and inward devotion. In France, they inspired salons where esotericism danced with early Enlightenment ideals, forming unlikely alliances between mystics and mathematicians. In England, echoes of Rosicrucian symbolism appeared in the early Freemasons, who adopted the rose, the compass, the hidden temple. Though never claiming direct descent, the resonance was unmistakable. Even in the colonies across the Atlantic, the whisper lingered. Benjamin Franklin corresponded with European mystics. The founding architecture of Washington, D.C., bears alignments more ritual than rational. The Great Seal holds an unfinished pyramid beneath the all-seeing eye, not a Christian symbol, but an esoteric one. And still no proof. No parchment declaring lineage, no central authority, no traceable succession. Only signs, only patterns, only the repetition of something just out of reach. This is how the Rosicrucians endured, not by standing boldly in history's spotlight, but by dissolving into its shadows. They were not the authors of revolutions, but they were its quiet undercurrent. They were not the fathers of science, but they reminded science of its forgotten twin meaning. They were not prophets, but they left doors ajar in the walls of perception. And always they returned to alchemy. Because alchemy was not obsolete, it was reframed. Its language became psychology, its rituals became metaphor, its symbols migrated inward. Carl Jung centuries later would study alchemical manuscripts, not for their procedures, but for their dreams. He saw in them the blueprint of the psyche, the process by which the fragmented self seeks wholeness. He did not call it Rosicrucianism, but the echo was unmistakable. And this is the paradox at the heart of it all. The Rosicrucians never demanded followers. They left no orthodoxy. They offered no salvation, only a path, winding, obscured, symbolic, a path that began always in silence. Because the rose, they said, blooms best in the dark. And if you listen closely beneath the hum of data and doctrine, beneath the monuments to reason and the ruins of belief, you might still hear it growing. Still hidden, still opening. A name survives not by being remembered, but by refusing to disappear. It lingers not in textbooks, but in footnotes, in marginalia, in the folds of obscurity, where dust preserves what clarity cannot. And among the many names carried by the currents of early modern Europe, one persists with a peculiar weight, Paracelsus. He was born Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim, a name as vast and fractal as the mind it adorned. But it was under the chosen name Paracelsus that his legend unfolded. Not beside, but beyond Celsus, the Roman physician he symbolically eclipsed. A declaration not of lineage, but of departure. To call Paracelsus an alchemist would be insufficient. He was not content with the furnace or the flask. He was a wanderer of the boundaries between medicine and mysticism, between the seen and the sensed, between the natural and the numinous. He walked through plague-stricken villages not as a man of detachment, but as one who believed illness had meaning, that the body spoke a language lost to most, that herbs, if understood rightly, could remember the harmony of the heavens. He did not seek to silence suffering, but to decode it. To the established faculties of Europe, he was madness wearing the robes of a doctor. He rejected the classical authorities with a kind of ruthless reverence. He burned Galen's texts not in contempt for the past, but in demand for its renewal. He believed knowledge was not to be inherited, but wrestled from the world directly. And in this solitary defiance, the Rosicrucians found resonance. Paracelsus died in 1541, decades before the Rosicrucian manifestos surfaced. But in the strange arithmetic of symbols, his absence became a presence. His writings, cryptic, syncretic, erratic, were circulated quietly among those who saw in them something more than medicine. They saw a compass. He wrote of the tria prima, salt, sulfur, and mercury. Not merely elements, but principles. Salt, the body, the base, the fixed. Sulfur, the soul, the fire, the motive force. Mercury, the spirit, the fluid, the bridge. These were not substances to be weighed, but metaphors to be lived. He spoke of the archeus, a vital force within the body that mirrored the soul of the world. He believed that each organ had a celestial correspondence, and that illness was a distortion of harmony between inner and outer stars. This was not superstition, it was structure. To Paracelsus, the universe was not chaos, but correspondence. Every plant, every mineral, every human being bore a signature, an imprint of purpose, a hidden code. To heal was to read that code to align what had been miswritten by fate or folly. And the Rosicrucians, emerging a generation later, wove these ideas like threads into their veiled doctrine. They did not cite him directly. They rarely cited at all. But the influence was unmistakable. The vision of a unified cosmos, where transformation was both physical and spiritual, where knowledge required more than logic, where healing was an act of decoding divine intention, this was Paracelsian. And through this lens, the line between alchemist and initiate blurred. Because what Paracelsus offered was not a method, but a way of seeing. To walk in his footsteps was not to memorize procedures, but to adopt a kind of double vision, where matter shimmered with metaphor and the body became a text inscribed by stars. It is easy from a modern perspective to dismiss these views as archaic, but in their time, they were not regressions, they were insurgencies. They challenged not ignorance but arrogance. They questioned the authority of systems that pretended completeness. And in the quiet spaces between wars and councils, others listened. The Rosicrucian manifestos speak of physicians unlike any others healers who understand both the body and the soul, who have studied in lands far beyond Christendom, who serve not for gain, but for harmony. These are not Paracelsus by name, but they are Paracelsian in essence. They are figures who belong to no order and yet act in concert, who walk unseen through cities in turmoil, not to convert or conquer, but to repair, to tend, to restore the hidden thread. It is no coincidence that the Rosicrucians placed medicine among their core sciences, not as chemistry, not as anatomy, but as alchemy of life itself. And as Europe slipped further into fragmentation, with kingdoms clashing and churches splintering, this quiet model of healing, of reading the soul through the symptoms of the body, offered a different kind of resistance. Not loud, not political, but enduring. Paracelsus, they believed, had preserved something, not a doctrine, but a pulse, a rhythm beneath the surface noise. and the brotherhood, if it existed, was less an institution and more a continuity of perception. A way of sensing the sacred not in heaven but in the mineral, not in the temple but in the cell, not in belief but in pattern. And this is perhaps the most destabilizing thought of all, that truth does not descend from above, but rises from below. That the divine hides not in transcendence, but in density. That transformation is not ascent, but integration. The alchemist does not flee the material. He enters it, dwells within it, and draws out its music. So too the Rosicrucian path leads not to light at the end of a tunnel, but to illumination within the tunnel. In the furnace, in the illness, in the fracture. This is the medicine Paracelsus whispered through fire and ink. And those who heard it, truly heard it, did not record it. They lived it. In the margins of history, in the hush between revolutions, in the hands that healed without praise, in the silence that followed when names were no longer needed. Because once a truth becomes visible, it becomes vulnerable, and the rose once exposed begins to wither. So the knowledge was passed quietly, through symbols, through gestures, through works left unsigned, a thread woven not into banners but into breath, and still today, in certain places, that breath remains. There are symbols that do not ask to be understood. They wait, patiently. Like seeds beneath stone, they rest in silence until the mind softens, until the eye forgets how to look, and instead begins to listen. Among these quiet emblems, few linger so deeply, so stubbornly, as the rose and the cross. The rose soft spiral of life unfolding inward and outward, carried within it the fragrance of mystery. It was not merely floral, it was geometric. Layers opening in ratios sacred to builders and breath alike. A symbol not of beauty but of process, of hidden centers, of cycles that repeat in silence. The cross, rigid intersecting lines, stood fixed in its starkness. Vertical met horizontal. Heaven intersected earth. Time pierced space. It was not originally Christian and perhaps never fully became so. It was older, found etched into stones predating dogma, a mark of convergence, of grounding. The Rosicrucians placed these two together not by accident, not as a banner, but as a cipher. The rose upon the cross was a paradox growth within sacrifice, unfolding within stillness, the sacred hidden inside the visible. It did not ask to be worshipped, only to be seen. And even then, not with the eyes, but with the inner gaze, the part of perception not taught in schools or sermons. The Rosicrucian use of this symbol was never explained in the manifestos. There was no doctrine of the rose, no explicit theology of the cross. It was offered without explanation, as if to say, this is not to be taught. It is to be remembered. Because a symbol in the Rosicrucian sense was not a signpost, it was a doorway, and those who gazed upon it long enough would begin to descend not into superstition, but into silence. Across Europe, this symbol began to appear in unexpected places. On the title pages of obscure books, carved into wood in forgotten libraries, woven into the floor plans of buildings whose architects claimed no allegiance to any order. In France, the Rose Cross surfaced amid the esoteric salons of the 17th century, not as a badge of membership, but as a murmur of recognition. In England, it appeared in cryptic marginalia of alchemical manuscripts, never central, always peripheral, like a glyph watching from the edge. And in Germany, where the manifestos first stirred the air, the symbol was carried forward by printers, scholars, and dreamers alike, each iteration slightly different, as if the symbol refused to be fixed. As if it insisted on remaining fluid alive just beyond capture. The structure of the Rosicrucian order, if it ever existed, was equally evasive. There were no ranks, no robes, no public rites. The brotherhood as described in the Fama was composed of 8 men who met annually at a secret location and otherwise lived anonymously in the world. They were doctors, philosophers, artists. They owned nothing, sought no fame, and passed their wisdom on only to those who asked not with words, but with longing. This was not a system, it was a resonance, and the symbol of the rose cross was its tuning fork. Those who vibrated with its frequency did not need instructions, they were already aligned. Of course, this secrecy invited speculation, and the absence of hierarchy invited projection. The Rosicrucians were accused of being heretics, or magicians, or spies for a hidden church, or agents of Lucifer cloaked in mystery. But none of these accusations held, because the Brotherhood offered nothing to fear, only the possibility that what we call reality is but one layer of many. In time, attempts were made to formalize the movement. In the late 1600s and into the 1700s, various groups across Europe began to claim Rosicrucian descent. Lodges formed, rituals were devised, degrees and hierarchies emerged. The symbol of the rose cross was adopted, replicated, stamped onto certificates and walls. But these were echoes, not origins. The original Rosicrucian impulse did not seek to establish an institution. It sought to preserve a current, and currents do not thrive in structure. They move through it. Some of these later groups preserved parts of the original resonance. Some veered into spectacle. Some fell into the very traps the manifestos had warned against ego power fixation on external signs. But the true symbol cannot be held, only reflected. And the rose cross in its deepest sense was not a mark of membership. It was a mirror. To gaze upon it was to be reminded of the path, not the path toward enlightenment, but the path through density, the vertical axis, the descent of spirit into matter, the horizontal, the movement of time, the diffusion of consciousness through form. At their meeting point, the rose, soft, living, fractal, the soul in bloom, not in spite of suffering, but because of it. This is not theology, it is not philosophy. It is what remains when all explanation has fallen away. And those who carried this symbol were not united by belief, but by orientation. A way of walking through the world that honored mystery over mastery, process over product transformation, over arrival. The Rose Cross did not promise salvation. It did not promise anything. It waited for the one who sees not with the eyes, but with the fracture behind the eyes, for the one who listens to the silence beneath the words, for the one who feels the sacred not in ascension, but in descent. In the darkest layer of lead, in the slow unfolding of grief, in the stillness, after the furnace has cooled, the rose opens. And on the cross, the point of convergence remains, not to redeem, but to remember that suffering is not the end, it is the vessel. And the symbol endures not because we protect it, but because it protects something in us from being forgotten. In the stillness between thoughts where language falters and time loses form, there flickers an ancient image, metal in flame, changing color, shifting shape, refusing final form, a crucible small and silent glowing from within. It is here that alchemy breathes, not as superstition, not as science misunderstood, but as metaphor too potent to be discarded. For centuries the world has laughed at alchemists, foolish men in darkened rooms chasing gold from lead, wasting lifetimes over ashes and fumes. But laughter can be a mask. Often what is most dismissed is what most deeply disturbs. And alchemy, in its true form, was never about gold. Gold was a shadow, a metaphor, a cipher. Alchemy asked not what metal could become, but what the self might become if placed inside the fire. The Rosicrucians knew this, or more precisely, they carried this knowing forward not in doctrine, not in detail, but in tone. Their texts spoke of transformation not as conquest, but as surrender, not as enlightenment, but as slow purification. The path did not rise like a ladder. It spiraled downward, inward, into the dense, the hidden, the unformed. Lead the beginning, gold the echo. The metals were never mere matter. They were archetypes, voices in the symbolic language of inner change. To understand them was to turn the gaze inward and accept that decay precedes light. That breakdown is not the opposite of growth, but its womb. The Negredo blackness was not failure. It was the sacred rot, the ego dissolving, the structures of false knowing crumbling into ash. The alchemist did not run from this stage. He stayed with it, watched it, allowed it to speak. Then came albedo, the whitening, a stage not of purity, but of clarity, of seeing through the illusion, of standing inside emptiness and noticing that something remains. Finally, rubedo, the reddening, the integration, the gold. Not physical gold, but a consciousness no longer at war with itself. The fusion of body and spirit, of above and below, of the sacred and the mundane. These were not promises, they were reflections. And the furnace was not always literal. The heat came in other forms: grief, confusion, illness, longing. The true fire of alchemy was the life that refused to be controlled. Within the Rosicrucian silence, this language was preserved not through instruction, but through evocation. The chemical wedding is full of fire. Candles that flicker with meaning, ovens that whisper riddles, burnings that cleanse rather than destroy. The 7 stages of the narrative mirror the 7 classical metals, the 7 celestial bodies, the 7 steps of the alchemical opus. Not overtly, not didactically, but unmistakably for those who could read without eyes. And this perhaps is what distinguishes the Rosicrucians from the merely secretive. They did not hide the path. They encoded it. They trusted the path to reveal itself only to those whose perception had already begun to transmute. Because to force transformation is to distort it. To explain the mystery is to flatten it. Only those willing to dwell in uncertainty could approach the furnace without shattering. The question then is not whether alchemy works. It is whether we are willing to let it work on us. In this sense, the Rosicrucian current remains as dangerous as it is invisible, because it does not ask you to believe, it asks you to burn. And so it lingers uninvited, unprovable, yet persistent, in the margins of philosophy, in the symbols carved into forgotten tombs, in the paintings that cannot be decoded, only felt. Even in the age of microscopes and particle accelerators, the symbols of alchemy refuse to fade. They reappear unexpectedly in dreams, in myths, in psychological maps of the human soul. Carl Jung again and again returned to the alchemical texts, not to mine them for history, but to listen for their echo in the unconscious. He saw the alchemical work not as delusion, but as an ancient mirror of psychic transformation. The furnace, the stages, the vessel, they were not scientific errors. They were inner architecture. And perhaps this is what the Rosicrucians foresaw, that the truths worth keeping must be buried inside symbols that cannot be erased. Not because they are hidden, but because they cannot be simplified. A truth too large for language must wear the robes of metaphor. A fire too ancient for reason must flicker beneath poetry. And alchemy in this light is not lost. It is merely waiting for the return of those who no longer seek power, but wholeness. The Rosicrucian path never promised certainty. It promised depth. Not salvation, but transformation. Not escape, but integration. And in the shadow of that promise, something quietly endures. In the sealed glass vessel, lead softens. Color changes. A new form whispers its way into being. No rush, no noise, only process, only time. And the alchemist watches, waits, listens. Not for gold, but for the silence that signals something essential has changed. And then perhaps in that stillness the rose opens once more. Not because it must, but because the fire has been honored. There is a word that does not age, a word older than language itself. It pulses beneath myths concealed in riddles whispered between breaths, where silence deepens immortality. Not the endless continuation of breath and bone, but something else, something more elusive. A continuity that does not resist death, but moves beneath it. The Rosicrucians never claimed to conquer death. They did not offer a potion or ritual to outlive time. But within the folds of their symbols, the promise of something unbroken lingers. A spark that does not die with the body. A thread that runs through decay. A flame that remembers its shape even when extinguished. Alchemy spoke of this, not loudly, never plainly, but with symbols too ancient to be casual. The philosopher's stone that most coveted of secrets was said to grant immortality not merely by transmuting metal, but by refining the alchemist himself into something incorruptible. The stone was not an object, it was a threshold, a condensation of all opposites, a moment where spirit crystallizes inside matter, where time and eternity fold inward like petals of a single rose. Many sought it, most misunderstood it, because they believed it would make them live forever. But what if it meant something else entirely? What if it was not meant to preserve the body, but to awaken what does not die? The Rosicrucians spoke often of renewal, reformation, restoration of lost knowledge, but they never positioned themselves as saviors. There was no preaching, no altar, no call for conversion. Instead, there was an invitation to remember something older than death. The continuity of knowledge that survives without needing a name. In the Fama Fraternitatis, Christian Rosenkreuz is described as having discovered the universal wisdom during his travels in the East. He returns to Europe not to boast, but to build quietly alone, a hidden tomb, a secret chamber, and when he dies, he does not vanish. He is placed in a seven-sided vault filled with symbols, writings, instruments, a vessel of preserved knowing to be found only when the time is right. He remains not alive but not absent. And here the idea of immortality shifts. It is not the man who persists, but the message, the memory, the resonance of a certain alignment that refuses to decay. Paracelsus hinted at this as well. He believed in a form of quintessence, an immortal principle distilled from nature present in all things, especially in those refined by fire. He did not separate the physical from the spiritual. To him, the body was not a cage, but a mirror, a material echo of something deeper. The Rosicrucians echoed that belief. In their silence, they preserved not formulas, but frequency. They believed that certain truths, once internalized, make the bearer immune to fragmentation, not because the flesh endures, but because the center no longer scatters. Some believed they possessed the elixir of life, a legendary liquid drawn from the stone itself, said to prevent decay, cure disease, and extend life indefinitely. But there are no recipes, no instructions, only metaphors. What if the elixir wasn't a substance but a state? A consciousness so purified it could no longer be undone? And what if those who attained it simply faded? Not by dying, but by ceasing to resist. Not by fighting time, but by moving beneath it. This was the deeper alchemy, not the manipulation of matter, but the transmutation of mortality into presence. Across history, whispers of such beings appear, figures who do not die but vanish. Apollonius of Tyana, the Comte de Saint-Germain, Christian Rosenkreuz himself. Not saints, not myths, not quite men. Their names pass through texts like fragments of a forgotten tongue. Were they real? It is not the right question. A deeper question is, why does the idea of the undying teacher recur? Why do we return, century after century, to the image of one who walks silently among us, unchanged, untouched, unclaimed by death? Perhaps because something in us recognizes that form of survival. Not eternal flesh, but eternal meaning. Not body preserved, but knowing that ripples across time without origin. The Rosicrucians did not deny death. They studied it. They placed it at the center of the work. Every alchemical diagram includes the mortificatio, the symbolic death, the dismembering, the decomposition, the silence after the vessel is sealed. The putrefactio is not failure. It is the crossing, the slow fermentation of what must be left behind. Only then can the white phase begin. Only then can the red appear. To seek immortality without death is to mistake the process. And so the brotherhood, if it ever was a brotherhood, crafted a philosophy of disappearance. It did not shout. It did not linger. It planted symbols in soil, then stepped back. And in this quiet withdrawal, they modeled another form of immortality. One that does not demand memory but leaves a residue in consciousness. A shape, a color, a symbol that cannot be explained and yet continues to open. That is the stone, that is the elixir, that is the true work. Not to live forever, but to touch something within that already does. And if one listens in the stillest part of the night, the whisper returns. You will not survive in form, but form was never the whole of you. The pages were yellowing, not with age, but with intention. A kind of slow, deliberate decay that preserved rather than erased. In their margins, a different language emerged, one of glyphs, diagrams, geometric spirals, fire circles drawn with trembling hands. These were not the notebooks of a mystic. They belonged to Isaac Newton, the architect of gravity, the harbinger of modern physics, the man whose name stands etched into the foundation of science. And yet hidden in the vaults of Cambridge in boxes unopened for centuries was another Newton, one the textbooks do not mention, one who believed not only in force and motion, but in purification, transmutation, and divine geometry, one who spent more years studying alchemical texts than he did writing the Principia, it is tempting to split him in two. To say this Newton was different from the Newton of science, that he stumbled, that he strayed. But what if the opposite is true? What if this was not deviation, but foundation? He did not pursue alchemy as a hobby. He copied entire treatises by hand. He developed symbolic alphabets to translate their veiled meanings. He constructed furnaces. He experimented not only with substances, but with symbolic correspondences, believing that nature encoded its secrets not in linear laws, but in layered mirrors. In one note, he referred to the philosopher's stone as the secret fire, a phrase found across Rosicrucian Hermetic and Paracelsian texts. He believed it to be real, not metaphorical, not fictional. A force that moved through all things, uniting them, refining them, burning away illusion. This was not the Newton taught in classrooms, but it was the Newton who whispered behind locked doors. And the question trembles again, as it always does in these moments. Why does the most rational mind of the Enlightenment kneel at the furnace of the ancients? Why does the man who gave us calculus believe that metals contain spirit, that transmutation is possible, that divine wisdom hides in obscure ciphers and riddles? Perhaps because he sensed that science in its early breath was not separate from mystery, that the world was not a machine, but a text. And every element within it, from gold to light, was a letter in the alphabet of something greater. The Rosicrucians, though never named in his surviving works, echo in the spaces between his lines, in the emphasis on purification, in the longing to return to a wisdom untainted by corruption, in the belief that the ancients had once possessed a knowledge now lost, and that it could be restored not through conquest, but through alignment. Newton read the Rosicrucian-like alchemists, Sendivogius Flood Meyer. He studied the Tabula Smaragdina. He traced the connections between biblical prophecy and alchemical symbolism. He believed history itself had a structure. That time followed a divine architecture, like an invisible cathedral built over centuries awaiting revelation. He was not alone. Many early scientists moved through similar corridors. Boyle, Kepler, Descartes to a quieter extent. The boundary between the sacred and the measurable had not yet ossified. It flickered, shifted, allowed for permeability. And in that space the Rosicrucian myth found footing. It did not compete with science. It gestured beneath it, whispered that the act of knowing was itself a ritual, a mirror, a flame. What would it mean to accept that the foundations of modern knowledge were not laid atop the ruins of mysticism, but alongside them? That rational thought did not grow in spite of alchemy, but because of it. Not by inheriting its formulas, but by inheriting its questions. Because alchemy never asked, "What is matter?" It asked, "What can matter become?" And the Rosicrucian path did not ask, "What is truth?" It asked, "What must dissolve in you before truth can enter?" The difference is subtle, but it is everything. And Newton, disciple of falling apples and lunar tides, saw in the language of alchemy a poetry deeper than formula. He kept this hidden. Whether out of caution or reverence is unclear. But in the silence of his private work, we glimpse a man unafraid to enter the furnace. Not to prove, but to transmute. In the end, most of his alchemical manuscripts remained unpublished. They passed from collector to collector, whispered about, but rarely studied. It wasn't until the 20th century that scholars began to reckon with the vast scope of his hidden labor. not the labor of madness, but of myth-seeking form. His diagrams, sometimes circular, sometimes squared, mirror the mandalas of other ancient systems. His vocabulary, spiritus mundi quintessence, ignis invisibilis, is not invention, it's continuation. He was not writing a new language, he was remembering one. And in that act of remembrance, the Rosicrucian trace lingers, not as influence, as atmosphere. Because the Rosicrucian mystery was never about who belonged, who wrote, who led. It was about those who heard the same silence, those who felt the same disturbance behind the veil of certainty, those who looked at the world not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a presence to be honored. Isaac Newton, father of modern science, walked in both worlds, measured stars by night, whispered to shadows by day. Not divided, but doubled. And perhaps this is the quiet fracture that still runs beneath history, that the minds who gave us certainty were born from uncertainty, that knowledge at its root grows in dark soil, and that even the most rational among us once listened for a fire that had no name. There is a silence older than thought. It hums beneath stone hides in forgotten temples, drifts through the smoke of extinct languages. A silence not of absence, but of density, of meaning compressed into symbol sealed by time waiting. And sometimes it speaks, not in words, not even in sound, but in arrangement, pattern, geometry. The Hermetic tradition was one such silence. It did not begin in the Renaissance. It did not begin in Alexandria. It may not have begun at all. It appeared like mist from a still lake already formed, already knowing, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a figure neither entirely god nor man Egyptian, nor Greek, scribe, nor myth. He was said to have written the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of sacred dialogues on the nature of the cosmos soul and divine mind. But the texts are not consistent. They contradict, overlap, echo. They do not teach, they invoke. Reading them is less an instruction and more a ritual. At their center is one principle, as above, so below. The universe is a mirror. The stars reflect the soul. The body reflects the divine. To understand one realm is to access another, not by climbing upward, but by looking inward. This idea was not entirely foreign to the Rosicrucians. In fact, it formed the soil from which their roots grew. The manifestos never name Hermes directly, but the symbols they used, the rose, the cross, the wedding of opposites, the silent vault, are hermetic in architecture. They point to an order where knowledge is encoded in structure, where truth is not argued, but arranged. Alexandria, before its libraries were burned, had once been such an arrangement. There the Hermetic Gnostic and early Christian texts shared air. There mystery was not feared. It was curated, translated, layered, distilled. The loss of that knowledge was not just a historical tragedy, it was a psychic rupture. And the Rosicrucians, centuries later, seemed to move within that wound, not to repair it, but to inhabit it, to retrieve what had sunk beneath the tides of empire and theology, to suggest that nothing truly lost was ever gone. They did not seek to resurrect Alexandria. They sought to preserve its echo. In their writings, the Hermetic impulse is quiet but insistent. The idea that the human being is a microcosm, that the body itself is a temple, that each part of the world is alive with correspondence if only one learns how to read. This reading is not analytical. It is symbolic. It requires a gaze that does not separate but weaves, that sees unity in duality, that hears silence inside sound. The Emerald Tablet, one of the most famous Hermetic texts, says that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. It is not instruction, it is reflection. Alchemy drew heavily from this, not just in metaphor, but in method. The solve et coagula, to dissolve and to bind mirrors, the Hermetic understanding that creation is always cyclical, that to form something new, the old must be broken down, not destroyed, but returned to potential. The Rosicrucian texts follow this rhythm. The story of Christian Rosenkreuz is not linear, it is circular. He journeys east, receives hidden knowledge, returns west, builds a tomb, dies, and is discovered only much later. His body is intact, his chamber untouched. Time did not claim him because he was aligned with it. Not in defiance of death, but in resonance with eternity. Hermetic thought, too, sees time not as a river, but a spiral. Events do not progress, they recur. And the initiate does not move forward, but inward. This is why the Rosicrucian knowledge cannot be taught, only remembered. It is not about learning new truths. It is about unburying what was always there. The Hermetic worldview was suppressed, its texts burned, its adepts erased. But it was not because they failed to explain themselves. It was because they refused to reduce truth to doctrine. They held a mirror instead. And mirrors are dangerous. They show not what should be, but what is. The Rosicrucians inheriting that mirror offered it without explanation. Those who gazed into it saw different things. Some saw madness, some saw magic, some saw only their reflection deepened, distorted, undone. In the Enlightenment, Hermeticism was mocked, declared unscientific, its symbols ridiculed, its texts dismissed as superstitious relics. And yet quietly they endured. Artists, mystics, and philosophers continued to draw upon them, not as belief systems, but as structures of thought too elegant to discard. Even in modern psychology, fragments remain. Jung's concept of archetypes, the collective unconscious, the process of individuation. These are not hermetic by name, but they breathe the same air. They point to a reality where transformation is symbolic before it is chemical, where meaning precedes measurement, where wholeness comes not from accumulation, but from return. And this is where the Rosicrucian current once again reveals itself, not as religion, not as science, not even as philosophy, but as remembrance. Remembrance of a time when knowledge was sacred, not because it was hidden, but because it could not be fully known. Remembrance of a language spoken not in words, but in resonance. Remembrance of the soul as a mirror, the world as its reflection, and transformation as the act of learning how to look. Not outward, but inward. Because in Hermetic silence there is no teacher, only pattern. And the pattern once seen cannot be unseen. Some silences are accidents, others are engineered. There are absences caused by time and absences left like traps. And then there are absences so precise, so surgically placed within the archive of history that they suggest a different kind of intention, not destruction, but concealment. The Library of Alexandria did not burn once. It burned repeatedly, piece by piece over generations. Scrolls lost in conquest, forgotten in politics, buried in religious cleansing. It is remembered now as a symbol of loss of erased wisdom, of knowledge turned to ash before it could become legacy. But it was more than a collection. It was an arrangement, a memory palace for a civilization that once believed knowledge could be held as light, not power. The Rosicrucians never claimed descent from Alexandria. They did not need to. The shape of their silence rhymed with that ancient wound. Because what was lost in the flames was not just texts, it was a world-view, one where the sacred and the scientific breathed the same air, where geometry was not just a tool, but a prayer, where the stars did not merely shine, they spoke. In Alexandria, Gnostics and mathematicians, physicians, and mystics studied under the same roof. They did not compete for truth. They collaborated on it. When the flames came, they took more than parchment. They severed a connection. And in that severance, something fragmented. The West forgot how to speak in symbols. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Enough that by the time the Rosicrucian manifestos emerged in the 17th century, they did so not as a continuation, but as a return. A haunting. They spoke to a Europe where knowledge had been splintered into categories, where mysticism was divorced from method, where alchemy was no longer understood as transformation, but dismissed as failure. And yet their texts were saturated with the vocabulary of an older coherence. They wrote of secret libraries, of hidden books sealed beneath sacred architecture, of vaults that opened only to those who already knew what they sought. Not metaphor, not exactly, more like memory disguised as myth. The chemical wedding describes a sealed tomb containing knowledge preserved by design. Its discovery is not accidental. It unfolds through trials, riddles, symbolic deaths. It demands a transformation not of intellect, but of being. Only the changed can enter. This is not fantasy, it is instruction. The idea that truth must be protected from the unready is older than Christianity, older than Greece. It runs through the mystery schools of Egypt, the initiations of Eleusis, the diagrams of Pythagoras. The path is never linear. It spirals, folds tests, not to withhold, but to refine. In every era, something is forgotten. But sometimes forgetting is not loss, it is camouflage. The Rosicrucians understood this. They did not try to rebuild Alexandria. They built something harder to destroy doubt. A precise, intentional crack in the wall of certainty. A question that could not be answered with books or laws, only with silence. And maybe, just maybe, with memory. They hinted that the wisdom of the ancients was not extinct. It had survived, but not in plain sight. It moved through symbols. It passed in codes. It slept inside architecture. It disguised itself in rituals misunderstood by those who performed them. It hid in plain sight, not because it feared exposure, but because only those with the correct resonance could recognize it. This is the Rosicrucian paradox. Nothing was hidden, but almost no one could see. The evidence was not buried, it was recontextualized. A carving here, a floor plan there, a sequence of numbers, a botanical diagram, a hymn, a painting, each fragment innocent on its own. But together they formed a constellation of echoes. Those who followed this trail often ended in silence. Some disappeared from record. Others were absorbed into other societies, Freemasonry, the Illuminati, esoteric Christian sects. Still others left behind manuscripts that no one could fully decode. The secrets, if they existed, did not vanish. They scattered, like embers, like spores, waiting for conditions to return. And still today the gaps remain. Entire civilizations with no origin story, symbols that predate the written word, mathematical systems found in ruins older than agriculture, perfect geometry carved by unknown hands, alignments too precise to be accidental, yet too ancient to be explained. The Rosicrucians never offered answers. They were not interested in solving mysteries. They were interested in preserving them, because some knowledge does not enlighten, it transforms. And transformation requires friction. Not everything lost was destroyed. Not everything hidden is gone. Some truths are buried not beneath earth, but beneath perception. And some libraries were never made of stone. They were made of minds, living vessels, walking archives, those who carried the resonance without ever speaking it aloud. Perhaps this is why the Rosicrucians were never found. Because they were not a group, they were a function that reactivates in certain conditions when systems become too rigid, when knowledge becomes too loud, when mystery is in danger of extinction. Then they return, not to restore, but to unbalance, to break the illusion that everything can be explained. They are not guardians of answers. They are midwives of rupture. And rupture is how remembering begins, in the void left by the burning library, in the silence where a book should be, in the uneasy pause between belief and knowing. Something ancient still breathes, not gone, only waiting. Change rarely enters through the front door. It seeps in beneath thresholds, through the cracks in certainty, through the questions no one dares to ask aloud. And sometimes it comes wearing the robes of something ancient, tattered, symbolic, misread, yet pulsing with the same urgency as it did when the world was still young. So it was with alchemy, as the age of reason began to ascend. So it was with the Rosicrucian impulse, disguised as myth, surviving as symbol, watching, as science declared its sovereignty over nature. While kingdoms shifted, and cathedrals trembled, and telescopes turned their gaze to the sky, something else moved beneath. The alchemist stepped back. The philosopher's flame dimmed. The great work once whispered in cloisters and forests slipped behind the curtain of credibility. But it did not vanish. It transmuted. Because that is what alchemy does. It does not resist change. It becomes it. In laboratories now called scientific furnaces, still glowed. But the language had shifted. Sulfur and mercury became elements. The philosopher's stone became a metaphor. And yet the structure remained 3 stages, 7 operations, the search for unity through division. The early scientists were not always aware of what they carried, but they carried it nonetheless. In the works of Robert Boyle, we find not only the father of modern chemistry, but a man who studied transmutation with earnestness. He experimented with invisible substances, speculated on incorruptible particles, flirted with the idea that metals might still be alchemically altered. He questioned the boundary between spirit and matter, not to destroy it, but to understand its architecture. Boyle corresponded with known Rosicrucians. He read the manifestos. He understood that the line between science and esotericism had not yet hardened. And for a moment, brief, fragile, the two breathed the same air. Others followed. Leibniz, co-inventor of calculus, wrote of a monad, a single indivisible unit of being a reflection of the entire universe. A hermetic idea refracted through rational thought. Spinoza saw God not above the world, but inside it, not as a father, but as the substance of all that exists. an idea dangerously close to the Rosicrucian notion of divinity diffused through form. Even Descartes, who carved the modern mind into dual parts, body and soul, thought and extension did so while haunted by dreams filled with symbolic fire-cryptic books and divine wind. He awoke shaken, believing he had been given a mission. He never spoke of it again. The great minds of the Enlightenment did not abandon mystery. They metabolized it. They translated the ancient metaphors into new forms, equations models. The sacred symmetry of the macrocosm-microcosm became mathematics. The harmony of spheres became physics. The secret fire became electricity. And yet something was lost. Not in content, but in tone. What had once been sacred inquiry became progress. What had once been transformation became control. The soul was no longer mapped beside the stars. It was excised from the map entirely. The Rosicrucians, or whatever remained of them, did not protest. That was never their way. They continued as they always had, in silence, in subtext, in the architecture of forgotten footnotes. Because they understood something that progress often forgets. That knowledge is not cumulative. It is recursive. We do not ascend through time. We circle it. Each age wears the mask of advancement, but beneath the same questions remain. What is matter? What is spirit? What becomes of the soul when it is no longer named? And here in the quiet unraveling of certainty, the Rosicrucian current re-emerged. Not in opposition to science, but as its hidden skeleton. Alchemy was never about chemical procedures. It was about process, not process as method, but as becoming. A way of moving through the world that demanded both structure and surrender. To practice the great work was to surrender to a rhythm deeper than intellect, to be broken open, dissolved, refined, and recombined. Science began to discard this language, but the process endured. In every transformation from iron to electricity, from ether to particle, the ritual remained: observe, dissolve, refine, integrate. The language of labs still echoed the metaphors of the furnace. What the Rosicrucians offered was not technique. It was memory. The memory of how to move with transformation rather than against it. The memory of meaning before measurement. The memory of symbols that do not explain but unlock. They did not seek to resist the Enlightenment. They became its shadow. And in the shadow they whispered reminders. That light without shadow blinds. That reason without mystery dismembers. That knowledge without transformation calcifies. Their presence was never in confrontation. It was in invitation. To remember what inquiry once meant. Not certainty, but reverence. Not control, but correspondence. In the centuries that followed, the Rosicrucian idea continued not through manifestos, but through echoes. Architecture that mirrored the tree of life. Music composed on hermetic principles. Art that placed geometry before image. Literature that hinted at vaults, keys, veils, chambers, always just below the threshold of direct meaning. They were not trying to be seen. They were maintaining a resonance. A frequency of thought where transformation is holy, where symbols breathe, where knowledge does not close but opens. And still today that frequency pulses. Not in temples, but in questions that refuse simple answers. In the urge to find unity in opposites, in the draw toward silence beneath noise, in the sense that we have not lost ancient wisdom, only forgotten how to approach it. The Rosicrucian flame remains lit, not because it survives history, but because it lives outside of it. Not as a relic, but as a rhythm. And those who hear it do not speak it, they remember it. In the soft crackle of intuition, in the weight of unnameable longing, in the feeling that transformation, real transformation, does not make you more, it makes you whole. Every structure eventually resists the very impulse that brought it into being. Institutions born from vision calcify into walls. Systems meant to illuminate become cages of explanation. And in the quiet space beneath those walls between stone and shadow, there is always something that begins to stir again. A pattern, a whisper, a return. The Rosicrucians never stood in direct opposition to science or church. That would have been too visible, too reactive, too easily erased. Instead, they moved beneath. Beneath the rhetoric, beneath the revolutions, beneath the machinery of belief and the rituals of power. They offered no new creed, no new kingdom, only an alternative current of inquiry. They were not interested in resisting knowledge. They were interested in redeeming it. As the Enlightenment spread its wings and illuminated Europe with new confidence, the Rosicrucian impulse did not vanish. It shifted. It became more diffuse, more cautious, more coded. Because to survive amid the rising tide of rationalism, mystery had to adapt. And so mystery changed its clothes. It entered salons and academies not as doctrine, but as intuition. It joined conversations about harmony mathematics, the soul of sound. It embedded itself in the language of proportion and architecture. It disguised itself in aesthetics. The Rosicrucians had always known that knowledge, when unbalanced, could fragment the human being. That a world dissected into parts would eventually forget the whole. And so they did not challenge science. They infused it, quietly, symbolically. This was not subversion, it was calibration, a reminder that the pursuit of truth is not only outward, but inward. Not only upward, but downward. That understanding does not come from clarity alone, but from the tension between clarity and unknowing. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, there were many who claimed to be Rosicrucians. Lodges formed, degrees were created, rituals performed beneath candlelight and Latin incantation. Some were sincere, others theatrical. Some sought initiation, others sought control. But the original impulse resisted formalization. It slipped through the fingers of hierarchy. It could not be owned. Because the true Rosicrucian presence was not in the institution, but in the fracture. The subtle spreading rift between modes of knowing. Where science measured mystery asked, where theology proclaimed alchemy waited, where institutions drew lines, symbols formed bridges. And through this fracture transformation slipped quietly into the narrative of progress. It found its way into the early Romantic movement, into Goethe's alchemical metaphors, into Novalis's dreams of the blue flower, into Blake's visions where angels walked through the ruins of Newtonian logic. These were not Rosicrucians by membership, they were Rosicrucians by frequency. Their work did not repeat the manifestos, it echoed them, because the fracture was not a wound to be healed. It was an opening, a space where logic falters just enough to allow something else through not irrationality, but a higher order of resonance. A synthesis the mind alone cannot create. In this opening, the Rosicrucian mystery survived. not by explaining itself, but by remaining. Remaining just obscure enough to avoid dismissal, just meaningful enough to invite return, just unsettling enough to provoke transformation. And transformation was always the center. Not revolution, not rebellion, but metamorphosis, silent, sacred, invisible. The world does not always notice when it shifts. Sometimes it tilts just slightly, just enough to bend light differently, just enough to allow another kind of thought to enter. That was the work, and the Rosicrucians never asked to be thanked for it. In fact, they asked to be forgotten. Non nobis Domine, they said, not unto us, O Lord. They understood that attention corrupts what it tries to protect, that mystery once made spectacle begins to rot. So they moved through time like a cipher, an idea without origin, a presence without name. And still they acted. Not as a body, but as a breath. Some scholars believe the Rosicrucians had a hand in the birth of speculative Freemasonry, not through documents, but through symbology, not through conversion, but through contagion. The compass, the square, the hidden temple, the silent observer. Symbols passed from hand to hand, changing shape, as they moved, never fully translating, always retaining a kind of charge. As if each glyph carried a vibration that refused to settle into mere meaning. These transmissions did not seek agreement. They sought resonance. And wherever resonance was found, the Rosicrucian pattern unfolded. In the architecture of unseen cathedrals, in the geometry of sacred music, in the psychological maps that tried to trace the soul. Always slightly out of reach, always disorienting, always incomplete. Because completion is not the point. Wholeness is not a solution. It is a state of surrender. This was the fracture they widened gently, insistently. The one that allows contradiction to live. The one that permits the paradox to stand uncorrected. The one where doubt becomes devotion and silence becomes knowledge. They did not ask anyone to believe. They only invited them to look again. And in looking, something shifted. Not in the world, but in the one who looks. That is how transformation begins. Not with thunder, but with a tremble. Not with the arrival of new facts, but with the collapse of false certainties. This was the Rosicrucian Reformation, not of government, not of church, but of perception. And perception once reformed reforms everything else. Names gather weight, titles gather power, and power invites rot. The Rosicrucians knew this. They saw how truth once named became commodity, how symbols once sacred became property. And so they let themselves dissolve into rumor, into metaphor, into the breath between sentences, where meaning lingers without shape. They never demanded loyalty. They never claimed authority. They never announced arrival. They simply began again. Anonymity was not a tactic. It was structure. A refusal to allow knowledge to be traced, owned, or worshipped. To be Rosicrucian was never to join a group. It was to become aligned with a current, a rhythm, a mode of thought that moves without seeking destination. And still they spread, not through conversion, but through resonance. Ideas travel faster when no one claims them. They slip beneath defenses. They inhabit the architecture of language itself. And this is how the Rosicrucian pulse moved subtly like groundwater, through the soil of the Enlightenment, through the cracks in theology, through the mirrors of mystics who no longer needed to define what they saw. Across Europe, the question persisted. Who are they? Pamphlets accused them of witchcraft. Treatises attempted to expose them. Political authorities feared infiltration. Religious councils warned against the seduction of their ideas. And still no one could point to a building, a leader, a book signed with a real name. There was no Rosicrucian headquarters, no central text, no founding father. The more the world asked, the less the world received. This was not avoidance, it was the method, because the real danger was not secrecy, it was recognition. The recognition that certain forms of knowledge cannot be institutionalized, that truth, when bound by law, loses breath, that mystery, when crystallized, becomes ideology. The Rosicrucians offered no ideology. They offered architecture, symbolic scaffolding, cognitive frameworks that allowed the seeker to move inward without collapsing. They placed no one on a pedestal. They promised no paradise. Their highest ideal was transformation, and even that was to be undertaken alone in silence without applause. In this they were immune to co-option because they had no center, immune to collapse because they had no structure, immune to persecution because they had no names to persecute. This fluidity allowed them to persist through war reform revolution. They moved through the French salons, the English occult revival, the Masonic rituals of the New World, not as masters, but as echoes. Not all who invoked their name carried their essence. Many who wore the rose and cross mistook symbol for power. But the current remained. And it remained because it was not built to be seen. It was built to be carried. Carried in dreams, in diagrams, in the quiet pauses of thought that resist conclusion. In the pull toward synthesis when the world fractures into categories. In the ache for unity without uniformity. In the intuition that not all knowledge is meant to be spoken. The Rosicrucian idea adapted. It entered poetry, where form bent around meaning. It entered psychology, where the soul was mapped not in facts, but in patterns. It entered systems of initiation that used ritual not to control, but to mirror. And always it avoided crystallization. Even those who tried to restore or formalize the Rosicrucian order often found it slipping from their hands. Attempts to define it ended in schisms. Attempts to lead it ended in echoes. Attempts to own it turned living mystery into dead system. Because the Rosicrucian current cannot be led. It can only be entered. It is not a river. It is the water inside the river. Not the music, but the silence that makes music possible. Those who truly entered it spoke less, not more. They disappeared from records. They published anonymously. They embedded insights into architecture, geometry, allegory. They trusted that the one who needed to see would see, and the one who did not would pass by untouched. The idea of a nameless fraternity was not fiction. It was protection, not to hoard knowledge, but to shield it from misuse. Because when knowledge becomes identity, it becomes weapon. And the Rosicrucians never sought followers, only witnesses. To witness is not to understand. It is to remain in presence. To hold space for a symbol long enough that it begins to reveal not what it is, but what you are. In this way, the Rose Cross was never about faith. It was about alignment. The vertical and the horizontal. The eternal and the temporal. The sacred and the broken meeting at one impossible point. And if the seeker stood in that point, balanced, silent, undivided, they became part of the current, not by belief, but by orientation. Orientation toward the mystery, toward process over product, toward surrender over mastery. This orientation cannot be taught, only remembered. And so the Rosicrucians did not teach, they invoked. They created symbolic environments where transformation could unfold not through instruction, but through resonance. And then they stepped away. Always, because presence corrupts what is meant to remain unseen, because the ego rushes in where symbols begin to bloom. Because once a structure forms, power seeks it. They were not afraid of power. They were bored by it. Power demands visibility. The work does not. The work begins in darkness, in slowness, in the soft unfolding of perception. And those who carried it did so without name, without lineage, without reward. They were the absence behind the architecture, the silence behind the scripture, the pause before the insight. And they knew that to endure they must vanish, again and again, until only the pattern remains, faint, recurring, a pulse in the collective, a frequency that asks nothing but reveals everything. Some knowledge moves like lightning, bright, loud, final. Other knowledge moves like root systems, underground, patient, unseen. It does not strike. It spreads. It does not seek sky. It nourishes the hidden connects, the distant forms unseen networks beneath a world too busy mapping surface. The Rosicrucians belonged to the second kind. They did not occupy cities. They occupied thresholds. They did not raise monuments. They left patterns. Across Europe and beyond, a strange cartography began to form, not in maps, but in echoes. Symbolic alignments stretched from cathedral to cave, from manuscript to music, from garden to grid. The world, when looked at through their lens, was not random. It was arranged. They saw knowledge not as accumulation, but as resonance. And the places where knowledge gathered real knowledge, transformational knowledge, did not form through institutions, but through intersections. Points of contact, junctions of frequency. A monastery where medicine met mysticism. A chamber where geometry met ritual. A manuscript that encoded cosmology within its margins. These were the true centers, not cities, not capitals, but symbolic pressure points across space and time. They did not leave maps, they left correspondences, in the facade of a chapel aligned to solstice, in the spiral of a staircase echoing the golden ratio, in a garden laid out not by utility, but by alchemical sequence. Those who knew how to see saw. Those who could feel the difference between design and intention sensed it immediately. This was not decoration. This was instruction, not direct but inward, a network of reminders, waypoints in a landscape most had forgotten how to enter. The Rosicrucians did not call this a grid, but they treated it like one. Energy was not metaphor to them, it was medium. Certain places hummed, others rested, some cracked open like wells. They believed that knowledge moved through space like sound amplified, absorbed, refracted. Their architecture reflected this. The invisible college they whispered about was not metaphor. It was not a school. It was a configuration. A circle of minds scattered by geography but united by alignment. Each one positioned like a node in a greater design. Each one unseen but activated. Together they formed something. not a brotherhood, a resonance field. And it didn't require proximity. It required coherence. This was not unique to the Rosicrucians. Other traditions knew of these networks. The Taoists mapped energy lines across China's mountains. The Druids traced ley lines beneath standing stones. The builders of Egyptian temples calibrated temples to starlight shadow and sonic vibration. The Rosicrucians didn't invent this idea. They remembered it. They remembered that real transmission does not need wires or pages. It needs structure, geometry, intention. And so they placed symbols where energy already gathered, not to claim the power, but to harmonize with it. Symbols became tuning forks, structures became instruments, people became conduits. And through them, something older than memory began to stir again. The network was not made of content, it was made of alignment. To be part of it required no initiation, no badge, no oath, only a turning of the inner compass towards the silent center. The center that did not lie in a temple or throne, but in the void between opposites. The rose, the cross, the point of stillness within intersection. From that stillness direction emerged not as instruction, but as gravity. The seeker felt pulled, not told, guided, not ordered. And so they moved, quietly, lightly, from city to village, from country to sea. One might find them teaching medicine in Prague, designing acoustics for a chapel in Lyon, studying ancient alphabets in Oxford, advising mystics in the Ottoman courts, disappearing in Persia, reappearing in Amsterdam. Each one alone, yet never isolated. Each one connected not by message, but by mode. They did not write each other letters of brotherhood. They wrote books of mirrors, encoded messages, fragments that did not declare but disturbed. And those who read them without readiness were left with riddles. But those who read them from the still point recognized something. Not fact, but familiarity. Because truth for the Rosicrucians was never external, it was mnemonic, a code to awaken what was already carried within. And so their network grew not in numbers but in depth, invisible not because it was hidden, but because it required a kind of perception that cannot be taught. Only remembered. This network still exists, not in halls but in hearts, not as a lineage but as a structure of attention. It whispers to those who look without seeking, to those who ask not what is true but what continues. And in moments of quiet coherence between dream and waking, between question and breath, the pattern returns. The places of power are not marked on maps. They are marked in the rhythm of forgetting and remembering. The geometry of mystery has never been broken, only ignored. But the network remains, waiting, not for recognition, but for alignment. And when it finds even one who listens, it activates again, not as lightning, as root. There are echoes that travel farther than sound, shapes that repeat across continents untouched by trade or conquest, symbols that emerge from distant soils yet carry the same signature as if memory itself does not obey geography. A spiral carved into stone in Newgrange mirrors a glyph in the Andes. A stepped pyramid in Mesoamerica stands in uncanny parallel with one half buried beneath Cambodian jungle. A wheel with 8 spokes, a serpent biting its tail, a flower with 6 petals enclosed in a circle of silence. None attributed, none explained, all recurring. The Rosicrucians never claimed ownership of these forms. They didn't need to, they recognized them, not as artifacts but as signals, remnants of a language not spoken with mouths, but felt with the body, known with the inner ear. They believed symbols were not invented, they were remembered. That beneath the stories of nations and gods, there lay an architecture of meaning older than time. They did not try to trace its origin, they followed its pulse. Because origin is a fiction, there is only rhythm, only return. To the Rosicrucians, the recurrence of symbols across distant civilizations was not coincidence. It was correspondence, a kind of deep resonance that occurred when a culture touched a certain threshold of perception, a moment when the veil thinned, when myth, matter, and meaning aligned. And what emerged again and again were the same shapes: circles, triangles, labyrinths, lattices of interlocking geometry. Not because these forms were efficient, but because they were inevitable. They echoed the structure of thought before language. They mirrored the movement of breath, blood, planet, light. And they carried encoded within their angles the memory of how knowing once felt before it was divided into categories. It is easy now to forget this. The modern world privileges the linear. It demands cause-effect origin proof. But the Rosicrucians lived in another mode, a spiral mode, where things return changed, where meaning is layered, where symbols do not define but open. They saw these recurring forms not as curiosities, but as confirmation. That human consciousness across epochs and oceans had once touched the same field. And each symbol, whether drawn on cave wall or cathedral ceiling, was a residue of that contact. Proof not of communication, but of communion. And this communion did not require culture, it required attunement, a willingness to descend, to dwell in pattern, to listen for resonance. When the Rosicrucians placed the rose upon the cross, they were not inventing a new symbol. They were collapsing old ones into union. The rose organic, unfolding, vulnerable. The cross structural, intersecting, eternal. Together they formed a threshold, a gate between breath and stone. And when this gate appeared again carved into wood in ancient India, worn as amulet in Sumeria, painted in pigment, long faded in the tombs of Anatolia, they did not cry miracle, they nodded. Because truth is not singular, it is structural. And the structure repeats, over and over. Not because we remember it, but because it remembers us. The Rosicrucians moved through the world with this understanding. They watched the empires rise and fall, watched borders drawn in ink and blood. But beneath every crown and creed they looked for the glyph. And they always found it. A fragment in the cathedral window, a ratio in the music of Bach, a shape hidden in the shadow of a monument. Each one a reminder, not of power but of process, not of belief but of balance. Because balance to them was not moral, it was mathematical. Harmony was not virtue, it was design. And design, when left uncorrupted, spoke a language clearer than scripture. A language not heard but recalled, not recited but re-entered. This is why the Rosicrucians never evangelized. They understood that real understanding cannot be taught, only triggered. A single symbol seen at the right moment could fracture a lifetime of false knowing. That was their method. Not argument, not persuasion, but insertion. A symbol placed, a word turned, a mirror tilted. And then absence. Let the one who sees see. Let the one who remembers remember. Because some part of us always knows, beneath the noise, beneath the names, beneath the maps. We know that the pyramid and the mandala, the seed of life and the golden ratio are not inventions. they are invitations. To return, to align, to dissolve. And perhaps that is why the Rosicrucians spoke so often of silence. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence after recognition. The moment when the mind surrenders not in defeat, but in awe. Because some truths cannot be spoken. They can only be reflected. In the curve of a petal, in the turn of a spiral, in the symmetry of a tear. And when enough symbols align, when the geometry sings, transformation begins, not as light, but as remembrance. Not as ascent, but as return. There is a language older than voice, one that moves not through mouths or pens, but through form, through vibration, through number, a language not designed to persuade or explain, but to align, not spoken, but revealed. And those who understand it do not translate, they enter. The Rosicrucians never claimed to speak this language. They claimed only to remember fragments of it, and those fragments did not come in words but in ratios, in signs, in silence. They whispered of a kind of mathematics that breathes, a geometry that does not describe but evokes, a number not counted but encountered. To them, numbers were not tools, they were symbols, living archetypes. Each one carried a frequency. One, the singularity, the seed, the beginning before division. Two, the reflection, the mirror, the first shadow. Three, the triangle, the mediator, the pattern of process. Four, the foundation, the square, the stable world. 7, the cycle, the sacred spiral, the days of the work. 12, the celestial code, the gates of the sky. These numbers recurred in texts, rituals, architecture, myth, not as calculations, but as keys. To the untrained eye, they were coincidences. To the Rosicrucians, they were the shape of truth. Not truth as fact, but truth as form. They believed the universe was built not merely of matter, but of meaning, and meaning in its purest state reveals itself in pattern, in harmonic proportion, in nested geometries, in frequencies too subtle for the ear, but not for the soul. This belief was not invented by them. It was remembered through them, echoed from the Pythagoreans who heard the music of spheres, from the Kabbalists who mapped creation through 10 emanations, from the builders of Gothic cathedrals who laid stone to sing light. The Rosicrucians did not innovate, they tuned. They saw in sacred texts not commandments but codes, in alphabets not speech but shape, in vowels not voice but vibration. They studied Hebrew not to read it but to feel its architecture. They studied Greek for the intervals between its symbols. They believed the alphabet itself in its earliest forms was not arbitrary. It was cosmological. Each letter a gate, each sound a signature, each word a vessel. And when these symbols were arranged properly, they did not explain reality. They invoked it. This is why their texts are so difficult to read. They do not teach. They trigger. Their phrases fold back on themselves. Their diagrams are recursive. They avoid conclusion like flame avoids stillness. To read them literally is to miss the point. They are not instructions, they are initiations. And initiation is not a transfer of knowledge, it is a disruption of pattern. The right sequence of symbol or sound can shake loose a deeper layer of perception. The Rosicrucians worked in this space, not as authors but as arrangers, curators of resonance, and the heart of their arrangement was a belief in a hidden axis, an unseen line that runs through all things. The ancients called it the world tree, the axis mundi, the pillar that joins above and below. To the Rosicrucians, it was a spiral, not vertical, not linear, but inward, a turning path, a vortex of awareness. They believed that language, true language, was not external. It was the residue of this axis, the way the spiral leaves tracks as it moves through matter. And the spiral appears everywhere. In galaxies, in the cochlea of the human ear, in ferns, in shells, in fingerprints. The spiral does not ask to be seen. It asks to be felt. Because it doesn't carry information. It carries instruction. Not what to know, but how to know. This is the Rosicrucian method. Not content, but calibration. To see not what something means, but how it means. To feel the difference between the surface of a symbol and its center. To trace a number beyond arithmetic into alignment. They studied the Fibonacci sequence not as curiosity, but as memory. They mapped planetary cycles not to predict, but to remember rhythm. They saw in ancient scripts a kind of anatomical map of consciousness. And through this sacred arithmetic, they rebuilt a cathedral that could not be touched. A cathedral of attention. Its stones were intervals, its pillars ratios, its altar the unspoken. They did not invite the world to enter. They built it inside those who listened. Because the real temple, the real work, the real transmutation is perception. And perception changes when aligned with deeper form. You begin to hear language differently, not as meaning, but as movement. You begin to see numbers differently, not as measure, but as memory. You begin to feel symbols, not as codes to decipher, but as echoes of something just out of reach. And in that reaching you soften, you dissolve, and something in you begins to spiral, not upward, not outward, but inward, toward the point where thought becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes return. This is not understanding, it is alignment, not achievement, but coherence. And the Rosicrucians, if they taught anything, taught this, that knowing is not accumulation, it is attunement, to symbols that do not speak but sing. And in their song, you begin to remember a language you never learned, but never forgot. The boundary begins to dissolve. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it softens. The line between symbol and substance image and presence language and silence. What once stood firm, measurable, named, defined, begins to blur at the edges like ink bleeding into damp parchment. Something has shifted, not in the world, but in the frame through which the world is seen. The Rosicrucians warned of this, not in warning, but in preparation. They knew that the deeper one moved into the work, the less stable the division between within and without would become. The philosopher's stone was never just a transformation of metal. It was the collapse of categories. The alchemical vessel was not merely a furnace. It was the mind. And now the vessel begins to crack. There is no noise, no explosion. Only a sense that the scaffolding of understanding carefully built from inherited names and logical progressions is no longer sufficient. There are too many reflections, too many overlays. Reality begins to echo itself. It is not illusion, it is multiplicity. What was once called real is no longer certain, and what was once called myth, dismissed, disassembled, safely archived, is beginning to glow with strange coherence. The Rosicrucians operated in this in-between, not to clarify, but to hold space for disorientation. Because disorientation is the precondition for new seeing. Their texts never resolve, their symbols never end, Their instructions, if they exist at all, are recursive, paradoxical, incomplete. This is not error. It is the method. They believed that clarity without mystery is blindness, and so they taught through disturbance, through contradictions that could not be smoothed, through diagrams that refused to align, through mirrors facing mirrors reflecting nothing but the act of reflection itself. The aim was never understanding, it was transformation. And transformation by its nature requires the disintegration of what was once stable. This disintegration has begun. The seeker now stands on the edge of the vessel, not as an observer, but as a participant. The laboratory is no longer external. The ingredients are no longer physical. The work continues, but the materials have changed. Now it is perception itself that is under fire. Now it is thought that melts. Now it is language that burns at the edges, and through the smoke the symbols move differently. No longer fixed, no longer separate. They slide between meanings like a veil caught in shifting wind. The rose cross trembles. The spiral uncoils. The alchemical stages collapse into one another. Solve et coagula, dissolve and bind no longer come in sequence. They occur simultaneously. The seeker dissolves as they bind. They bind as they dissolve. There is no longer progress, only rotation. The mind resists this. It wants a chart, a system, a narrative that builds. But the Rosicrucian current does not build. It weaves, it layers, it spirals inward, not to arrive, but to become lost in the becoming. There is a danger here, not of madness exactly, but of fragmentation. The boundary between symbol and self grows thin. The rose is no longer on the page. It is in the body. The cross is no longer metaphor. It presses against the skin. The work is no longer an idea. It is the air being breathed. And still no guide appears, because this stage has no guide, only echoes, only the memory of diagrams that no longer hold still, only fragments of phrases that once pointed now circle. The philosopher, the mystic, the scientist all merge. Not because their truths align, but because their boundaries collapse. What was once external, the text, the flame, the ritual, moves inward. The laboratory becomes the dream. The formula becomes the breath. The ritual becomes the turning of the gaze toward silence. The alchemical process does not conclude. It loops, and with each cycle the boundary blurs further. The symbols begin to act, not as representations but as agents. They do not describe truth. They evoke it. They do not explain mystery. They generate it. There is no longer a difference between reading and dreaming, between memory and imagination, between what was sought and what now seeks. This is the Rosicrucian paradox, that the further one moves into the work, the less one can say what the work is. There is no mastery here, only dissolution, only the soft unmaking of certainty. Some retreat, some crystallize their experience too soon. They build systems, they form orders, they write doctrines to capture what cannot be held. And the current moves on unfazed. It is not stopped by structure, it simply passes beneath it, waiting for the next fracture. The next one who sees not with the eye, but with the unguarded breath. The next one who forgets just enough to remember differently. Because this stage, this loss of distinction, this erosion of boundaries, is not an accident. It is a necessary phase in the deeper work. Alchemy was never about control. It was about surrender. Not the surrender of belief, the surrender of form. And now the forms falter. Letters lose shape, symbols bleed, names echo until hollow. What remains? Only rhythm, only silence that vibrates, only breath that circles back to itself. This is the furnace few name, the stage few teach, the moment in the work where even the guide must vanish. Because nothing can follow through this passage except that which is willing to dissolve completely. Not to die, but to become unrecognizable. The Rosicrucians never described this stage. They left only fragments, not to mislead, but to protect. Because to name this moment is to fix it, and what must happen here cannot be fixed. It must happen in motion, in unknowing, in the sacred disorientation that is not confusion, but the womb of what comes next. It does not end with a sound, not with revelation, not with discovery. No thunderclap, no rapture, no curtain drawn to reveal the hidden architecture. It ends, if it can be called an end, with quiet fracture. A silent split deep beneath perception where something once solid gives way. And yet nothing falls. It is not collapse, it is dispersal. Like dust when breath moves through still air. Like thought when it reaches the edge of its own echo. The Rosicrucians never described this final phase, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unspeakable. The deeper one passed into the layers of the work, the more language became burden. Symbol became shadow. All the maps, the formulas, the sacred geometry, they did not disappear, but they ceased to serve. They had done their task. They had brought the seeker to the edge of what could be known. And then they faded. What remains is not knowledge, it is awareness. Not an answer, a presence. Not certainty, only a stillness that cannot be undone. This is the Rosicrucian ending, not an arrival at truth, but a falling away of the need to grasp it. Not transcendence, but transparency. The self becomes thin like fog at dawn. There is no climax, only clarity too subtle for celebration. And perhaps that was the point all along, to carry the seeker not toward possession of secret knowledge, but toward the relinquishing of the impulse to possess, to dissolve even the desire to transform, to stand within unformedness and no longer resist. The brotherhood was never a group, it was this space, this atmosphere where those who touched the deep work would recognize each other not by signs, but by silence, not by agreement, but by disorientation. Because only those who had lost their orientation to the world as it had been taught could enter what the Rosicrucians truly guarded. And what they guarded was not a vault of ancient texts. It was a fracture, a precise necessary fracture in the continuity of inherited perception. The tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz, as described in Fama Fraternitatis, is discovered by accident, or so it seems. It is opened not with force, but through resonance. Inside the perfectly preserved body, the concentric architecture, the inscriptions, every detail, symbolic, impossible, intentional. But this was not proof of immortality. It was an image of inner structure, a metaphor of the self that endures not by refusing death, but by accepting dissolution as its own form of completeness. And so the seeker standing now where the texts no longer reach begins to understand this was never a path to something. It was a return to something never lost, only misnamed. The philosopher's stone is not a thing. It is the silence that remains when all things fall away. The great work is not a process. It is the willingness to remain inside process without seeking end. And the Rosicrucians, who once seemed mysterious, distant, unreal, now appear as what they always were, a gesture, a breath in time, a brief, ungraspable motion in the direction of realignment. They were not keepers of secrets. They were instruments of forgetting. Not forgetting as loss, but forgetting as purification. The stripping away of concept, the fading of belief, the soft unraveling of knowledge until it becomes awareness without edge. And in this unraveling, the seeker disappears. There is no reward, no master to greet them, no confirmation. Only the ongoing rhythm of dissolution. Even memory becomes unreliable. What were the symbols? What were the stages? The rose withers, the cross dissolves, the spiral unwinds beyond geometry. There is only the echo of having once followed something and now having become it. Not as identity, not as role, but as presence without distinction. This is the final Rosicrucian offering to lead the one who seeks so deeply into the heart of the labyrinth that they forget they were ever separate from it. The mystery does not answer itself. It devours the one who questions, gently, completely. And what remains? A kind of peace, but not comfort. A kind of light, but not vision. A state where the boundary between self and symbol world and meaning, past and presence no longer holds. And the work continues, not through hands, not through texts, but through subtle pattern, rippling outward quietly without signature. And the world ever so slightly begins to shift, not by revolution, by recognition. A whisper across centuries, a gaze that no longer searches, a silence that does not wait to be filled. This is how the Rosicrucians vanish. Not through secrecy, through saturation. They are not gone, they are diffused. In every spiral that reappears, in every symbol that resists meaning, in every thought that dissolves before completion. They did not leave behind teachings. They left behind a crack, a space between what is said and what is felt, between the diagram and the breath, between the name and the presence. And through that crack, the work continues, unseen, unclaimed, unending. What remains is residue, a faint, persistent hum beneath perception, not a message, not a code, not even a memory, but the weightless outline of something once encountered. It does not speak, it does not instruct, but it lingers. And in its lingering, the shape of absence becomes its own kind of presence. There are no more signs to follow, no further symbols to decode. The spiral has curved inward so completely that movement is no longer possible. Only stillness, only the breath between what was and what no longer needs to be. This is the end of the work. Not a conclusion, but a cessation. Not a revelation, but a release. What began as a ripple in the surface of thought has now become an erosion of form itself. The seeker, if such a figure still exists, has been carried beyond the borders of inquiry. What remains is not someone transformed, but someone removed. From needing to know, from needing to hold, from needing to name. The Rosicrucians did not offer salvation. They offered structure. But now even the structure is gone. It has done what it was meant to do. Like scaffolding after the cathedral is built, not abandoned, but absorbed. Dissolved into the very thing it helped to shape. There are no final instructions, no closing rites, only the fading echo of the process itself reverberating in silence. And still something stirs, because dissolution is not destruction. It is continuity without form. The philosopher's stone was never meant to be held. It was meant to be passed through. A moment, not an object. A pivot between layers of being. You do not possess it. You disappear into it. And then you remain. But not as seeker, not as initiate, not as witness. You remain as rhythm, as presence stripped of selfhood, as the part of perception that no longer returns for meaning. This is what the Rosicrucians meant by immortality. Not a continuation of time, but a cessation of opposition. No longer body versus spirit, no longer symbol versus substance, no longer inner versus outer. Only the quiet persistence of that which never needed protection, because it could not be harmed. You realize now the brotherhood never needed to be found. It was never assembled. It was never scattered. It existed only as potential, as alignment, as a field that gathered itself wherever and whenever the inner work was allowed to complete itself in silence. And that field did not need to survive in history. It survived in pattern. A carved rose, a hidden chamber, a phrase with too many meanings. You begin to see these things now not as messages from the past, but as activations placed like seeds in the body of time. They never waited to be discovered. They waited to be remembered. Not remembered by intellect, but by resonance. By that part of the self that carries no name and needs none. And when enough of these seeds are felt, not decoded, not claimed, just allowed, the field awakens again. Not as event, not as movement, but as presence diffused throughout consciousness like gold beaten so thin it becomes invisible. The Rosicrucians were never guardians of secrets. They were stewards of forgetting. Forgetting the false, forgetting the surface, forgetting the illusion that truth must be external, loud, provable. They did not build temples, they emptied them. They did not ask for reverence. They erased the need for it. And now their silence is complete. Not because they are gone, but because they are everywhere. In the shape of thought before it solidifies. In the pause before speech becomes word. In the breath that does not seek purpose. They remain where perception folds inward and does not return. The work ends here. There is no ascent, no unveiling, no arrival, only the softest kind of collapse, the final undoing of the self that searched. And if the seeker disappears into that silence, there is no sadness, there is no celebration, there is only stillness, like the air before a bell is struck. But the bell is never struck, because there is nothing more to call. The sound has already happened. You were the echo. And now there is only the air. Still, unformed, alive. The Rosicrucians left no final message. Only this. A structure that disappears once entered. A path that turns back on itself until it becomes space. A symbol that melts into breath. And breath into nothing. But not the nothing of absence, the nothing of presence so complete it no longer needs a shape. This is not enlightenment, this is not truth. This is what remains when the need for either dissolves. Thank you for walking through the silent axis of forgotten knowing. If this story touched something in you, a pause, a memory, a fracture, you are already part of the pattern. You can follow other whispered histories, unfolding gently across the void at Deformed History. The current always continues,